The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell. Now, this book was my introduction to Cornwell here, an author that any lover of historical fiction has probably heard of at some point or another. Whether it's his Sharp series of novels set during the Napoleonic Wars, his Saxon stories set in medieval Wessex, his Grail Quest series as well set during the 100 Years' War, or the Warlord Chronicles, starting with The Winter King. And Bernard Cornwell, in what little I've read of him so far, is quickly becoming a reliable author I can fall back on. That is to say, let's say I'm in a bookshop and I can only buy one book. Cornwell is always a safe bet, I've learned. His books are very easy to read, very engaging, and more than anything, very well researched, especially given how prolific he was, writing 2 books a year for the longest time. So with that, let's get into it, why don't we? What is The Winter King all about? The novel is set in what is popularly called sub-Roman Britain, that is, the period of time between the withdrawal of the Roman Empire from Britain in 410 CE until the entrenchment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms across England over the following couple of centuries. The novel follows the growth of a boy called Derval, based on the real-life Saint Derval, as he grows into a warrior under Arthur, accompanying him and his warband across the length and breadth of Britain. So, the novel is one of Arthurian legend, about the wars between the native Britons and the ever-encroaching Anglo-Saxons on the east coast of the island. But it isn't framed in the way you might expect for an Arthurian story. The novel essentially takes the legendary figure of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and whatnot, and reconceptualizes that entire mythological cycle as if they were real and somewhat plausible historical events. And in that regard, I find the novel incredibly innovative, in that it constantly asks itself, how do we realize mythology? How do we construct these legends into a plausible historical narrative while remaining fantastic enough to explain why those legends could have arisen in the first place? So instead of being a straight conversion from history to fiction, i.e. the real Thomas Cromwell to a fictional Cromwell, the real Emperor Claudius to a fictional Claudius, the novel goes from fiction to history to back to fiction again, if you get what I mean. A fictional story of an ostensibly historical narrative drawn itself from a largely fictional set of legends. So in the novel, King Arthur is not a king, but a warlord like a million others in Britain fighting back against the Saxons. Excalibur is not this magic sword, but again, just a sharp stick of metal like any other. These characters, Arthur, Merlin, Lancelot, Galahad, Guinevere, are reduced to their most plausible forms in explaining how the myths that we know could have arisen and developed. Lancelot in particular here is quite interesting in that he's the complete opposite of the archetypal, brave, chivalric hero we see in legend, only because he's wealthy enough to essentially hire a team of bards and poets to act as a PR team, essentially. Merlin, as well, is this absolutely unhinged druid who just shows up, causes trouble, and leaves throughout the novel. He's this amusing, ridiculous character, probably my favourite in the novel. And on the topic of druids and druidism, it leads me to one of my favourite elements of the novel, how it incorporates magic, as in spells and curses and rituals, that many of the characters perform. Because, as I said, this is historical fiction, this is not a fantasy novel. Magic does not exist. But the entrenched, almost existential threat within the novel, within 5th century British culture, that it could exist, and the fear that it inspires almost wills it into existence in and of itself. These spells and curses and whatnot only work because their victims believe them to be true, which in turn inspires further belief in its legitimacy. And that is what I find so fascinating about the novel, how Cornwell is able to mix up these elements so well. It's such a great mixture of history and fiction, but with an alluring vibe of dark fantasy almost, without it actually being fantasy in the first place. And in that regard, it's such a fun book to read, seeing how Cornwell twists and turns these myths into a historical narrative. I'm not surprised that it says here on the cover that Cornwell considers these books his favourite, because, yeah, I reckon they were an absolute blast to write. But I digress. As I've touched on, there's a lot of fun to be had here when it comes to the characters. The two central protagonists of Derval, as the narrator, and Nimue are great, especially Nimue, if I'm pronouncing that even slightly correctly. She's probably the most intriguing character in the novel, very complex and fascinating to read about. One of those characters that you just love to read whenever they appear, much like Merlin, as I mentioned earlier. And broadly speaking, the plot is very interesting. As with all of Cornwell's novels, you can see just how incredibly well researched they are, showcasing the political strife between the remaining Brythonic kingdoms in Britain during this time period. And I should also say, it can be a very disturbing book at times, as a lot of these medieval historical fiction novels are, like The Pillars of the Earth and whatnot, to draw an example. They are books that don't shy away from being very bleak and very brutal. This novel in particular is very much the Monty Python and the Holy Grail-esque sub-Roman Britain. That's the only way I can describe it. You know, plague-ridden peasants living in wooden huts and rolling around in shit. It really does take this narrative of Britain being this horrible, lawless hellscape following the fall of the Roman Empire, and it runs with it. The novel is brutally bleak and violent at times. It also does feature at least one particularly harrowing rape scene, so, you know, be advised if that's particularly upsetting to you. But on the flip side, it's really quite fun in places. Some of the characters, like Merlin, and the novel's secondary protagonist, Nimue, who's an apprentice priestess of sorts, are absolutely nuts, and so much fun to read about, which is valuable. I know this label of the Dark Ages is a very old-fashioned, quite erroneous term to describe this period in modern historiography, but good lord, it does feel like the Dark Ages sometime, whatever that may mean. So, it is a relief that there's not comic relief per se, but it's not all doom and gloom. There are great, light-hearted moments that really tie the story all together, so it's not all war and death and God knows what else. And I love how Cornwell is able to reconstruct the social and cultural climate of this period of British history, like the relationship between traditional pagan beliefs and the emerging Christianity. I also like that it's not a simple Arthurian narrative of the Britons against the Saxons, as if they're two monolithic entities, but rather the Britons and the Saxons, mainly squabbling amongst themselves over their own petty kingdoms. And on that topic, the battle scenes, the action scenes in the novel are incredible, which I know isn't anything new. Cornwell's quite well known for his grand, very well-constructed battles, but this being my first foray into Cornwell's work, I can certainly see why people think that, especially given its first-person narrative. You really do feel like you're there, you know, side by side in that shield wall defending the citadel from whoever shows up at the gates. I don't know how historically accurate it is, the non-Arthurian part, that is. Probably very much so, given Cornwell's reputation for that, but it feels authentic, it feels engaging. You always have a complete picture of the battlefield at any one part, as he describes it. I really like that the novel is very much grounded in the original works of mainly Welsh poetry from which the figure of King Arthur arose, as later revisited by medieval authors like Geoffrey of Monmouth, like Chrétien de Troyes, like 500-600 years later. And for more on that subject, I would highly recommend this video by Cambrian Chronicles. Fantastic YouTuber in general, but this video in particular, I think really elucidates the general misconception as to what King Arthur was, essentially. But I think that's that. I think I've covered all the things I wanted to. I appreciate that this video is a little more scatterbrained now that I look back at the script, but that's the point of these videos, to be my honest, general thoughts in a more spontaneous manner on whatever book I'm talking about, rather than an in-depth, structured review. But to leave with my final thoughts on the novel, it's a book I absolutely devoured last year when I read it, and the world building, which feels strange to say, given that it is our world, it is historical fiction, and world building is typically a term you would apply to fantasy works of fiction, but nonetheless, let me run with it, the world building really is quite something. But I think I've laboured the point enough there. A book that feels like fantasy, but isn't. And I would highly recommend it, especially if you're a fan of historical fiction like I am. It was probably one of my favourite reads of last year, and I recently bought the sequel. I completely forgot to mention that as well. It's part of a trilogy, which I look forward to reading in the near future, and most likely devouring it just as quickly as I did the first one. But yeah, that's about it, I reckon. Have a fantastic day, especially if the weather is as good as it is here in England at the minute, which, you know, is a first. And thank you for watching.